Well, Happy New Year, everybody. That was a bit muted. Happy New Year, everybody. That's better. That's better. If you don't know me, my name's Kenny. I'm one of the leaders here, and it's a joy to have you with us at the start of 2022, whether you're a regular or whether you're visiting, whether you're coming back to see us after a while away. If you're younger with us, if you're one of the children, there are some sheets for you. Does someone want to wave some about if you've got one? I'll wave it back for me, Anna. There you go. There's a younger sheet and an older sheet. They're on the desk if you want to get one. You need to be able to read for the older sheet. That probably gives you the bar of where they separate. And they might help you just as we go through our time in 1 Corinthians today. I don't know about you, but there is something about the new year that I love. It's probably something about my slightly optimistic nature that likes planning, likes looking forward to the year ahead. In fact, Jen got me this. It's brilliant. A new planner called The Power of Three, which I thought Pete would like because he loves his threes. But the idea is you can set 3 aims for the year, 3 big goals, and then each quarter of the year you can set 3 targets to meet them that quarter, and then each month you can set 3 things to do that month to help you on your way. And I love the idea of starting a new year with all this planning and this thinking of what might be. But it did get me thinking as we start 2022, where as a church are we potentially going this year? Where might we be aiming? What has 2021, the last year, shown us about ourselves and us as a church that might be better, might be different in 2022? I worked through my diary from the last year. I realised that last year, in lots of ways, as you look back, was a struggle at points for many of us. There were periods of isolation for each of us. There was probably more conflict than I think we've seen before. There was more complexity for many of us in life. Yet also, as I look back, there were real times of joy, weren't there? There were times as a church where we first gathered back together here in this building. There were times when we first sang together, where we first took communion together. Lots of us found encouragements and joy in the new small groups, in the read and the book we looked at over the summer. But off the back of all that, what might we focus on for 2022? It dawned on me as I thought that most of us don't actually need more goals, more visions, more things to be told to do this next year. To be honest, we've all got several years' worth of those built up that most of us have done nothing about. And I think we've also learned, perhaps the hard way, that most of these things aren't in our control. If we're not careful, our relentless pursuit of our goals, even Christian ones, they start to drain the joy and the hope from life. So today, as we start 2022, isn't about goals for us as a church. It's not about setting some kind of vision. It's more about thinking about what kind of tone we want church life in 2022 to have. I'm going to intentionally stay away from lists of things that we could or should do. But instead I want to focus as we start the year on who we are and who by God's grace we can be. And I think there's two interrelated things that will be good for us all, whatever this next year brings, or for that matter, whatever this next few weeks brings. I think I'd like 2022 to be a year where the character of our church's life is marked by us knowing in our heads and in our hearts once again God's real and deep love for us, so that we can be those who are marked by our love for one another. Where the tone of our church life becomes more of rejoicing in God's love and patience and kindness towards us, and experiencing that together in the ways we reflect it in our lives. In many ways, love is, in some ways, at the heart of Paul's letter to the 1 Corinthians. The concept of love itself, it runs through the whole Bible from beginning to end. It's central as you look to who God himself is, and therefore it should be central to our life as a church. Love in the Bible, it is in emotion, it is a pattern of thought, and it is a way of acting and doing. It's shown in what we do. And these few verses we had read in 1 Corinthians 13, they're all about what love does, about how love works itself out in the day-to-day, about how the things that we think and the things that we feel should be displayed. To quote from one commentary, love is the lifestyle that reveals what genuine, renewed humanity is all about. Love, it is a lifestyle that reveals what humanity, living under God, really should be like. And our love, of course, our love that we see is simply a reflection of God's love for us. In 1 John, we love because he first loved us. We know how to love. And we only know how to love because we have seen and we have experienced God's love for us. 1 Corinthians 13, it is in some ways a picture of God's love for us. It is a picture of God's love for you. And it starts with these 5 words. Love is patient and kind. Patience that comes from love is one of the core attributes of God that runs through all the scriptures. It comes up again and again and again through the Bible story. It's often described as him being slow to anger. I mean, it's in God's very name. In Exodus 34, when God declares his name, he says, he's the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. It's how we see God acting towards outsiders and the evil and the wicked in Jonah. We hear this at the end of Jonah in Jonah 4. Jonah says, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? This is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. But it's also how God continues to act towards us now. Even though we mustn't presume on it, in Romans 2, Paul says, do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? When you think about God, when you think about who he is, his loving patience, his slowness to anger, his willingness to wait before acting in judgment, even if it's deserved, should be pretty central to your thinking. God's love, it doesn't respond rashly. It doesn't jump in even when it could. Because it wants to give people, it wants to give others as long as possible to get things right, to sort things out, to turn, to repent, to change. Patient love would rather continue to be rejected and wronged than harm someone else by allowing anger to build up and frustrations to flare. God's love, it's shown in his patience to us. But what does God do? What does God do whilst he is waiting patiently? Well, in 1 Corinthians, he is kind. He continues to pour out his goodness to us. If patience on one hand is slightly passive, it's not doing what God rightly could, then his kindness on the other hand is going completely the other way. It's active. It's giving us what we don't deserve. God's kindness, it recognizes our frailty. It shows us compassion rather than judgment. It forgives readily. It wants what's best for us. It wants what's best for us in the middle of our rejection of him, in the middle of our turning from him. I mean, listen to Jesus himself in Luke's Gospel. Jesus said this, he said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And they, the soldiers, cast lots to divide his garments. Jesus is being crucified at that moment, and he cries out, Father, forgive them. Patience, loving kindness. That's the extent of God's kindness to us. His loving kindness to you. Undeserved. Not following or after we've repented and said sorry and turned back to him, but before. Kindness, rooted in love, that wants to do good for those around, both friends and enemies, long before it's ever been deserved. And that's our experience, isn't it, when we think and ponder of God? How often have we all turned away from God? Sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, maybe even for years. How often do we reject him? Yet, how often have we found him waiting for us to come back? How often have we found him holding back his judgment, still pouring out blessing upon blessing on us, while we continue to walk the other way? If over the years you've lost sight of God's love for you, his patience and his kindness towards you, then perhaps 2022 can be a year where you remember it again, where you see it again, where you know it again, when you look with fresh and with new eyes to see his patience towards you in the midst of your frailty, in the midst of your sin, when you see again his undeserved kindness across your life. And here's something that might just help you to do that, to make that movement. And I'm well aware that what I'm about to say stands up against a lot of the wisdom of the world around us. I think there are lots of us who are tired. Many are anxious. Life for lots of us is uncertain, and maybe we all feel a bit lost. Many, I think, are struggling to see God's patience, his love, his kindness, and that can lead to a certain dryness in our joy. Often in those moments, we're tempted, aren't we, to hide our frailty, to hide our limitations, to want to pretend our sin and our struggles don't exist, to try and manufacture a way of thinking by what we tell ourselves and living that at least outwardly exudes a sense of joy. Let's just try and be joyful. Let's try and be certain. Let's pretend to be the person we wish we were. But as we do that, I think we lose our ability to experience real joy, our ability to experience real peace. Because in doing that, we can no longer really know God's loving patience to us because we don't need it. We can no longer really know God's loving kindness to it because we don't need it. If we don't see and refuse to see our sin, how can we ever know God's patience and experience it? If we don't see our frailty and our need, then how can we ever really know his blessings and his kindness? And so if we're not willing to be open before God, if we're not willing to recognize these things and deal with them, then we never really experience his love. It can be scary to open ourselves up in that way, even to God. It can be scary in all sorts of ways because it sometimes feels like going backwards. We already feel like a little bit of a failure. We already feel quite joyless. So the last thing we want to do is drag our failures and our vulnerabilities up before God. Won't that make us feel worse? So we don't really want to try and trust in God's kindness and provision in case it fails us. But those things, they're not backward steps. They're necessary. They're necessary to restoring how we think and how we relate to God. If we're to experience his joy, the joy and the peace that comes from knowing his loving kindness. Jen and I, we've been watching, this is what you do over Christmas, you watch junk TV, don't you? We've been watching a programme called Sort Your Life Out. I wonder why we turned that on. It's actually quite fun. But basically, it's people whose houses are full of too much stuff and too much junk. You can probably all relate to that at the moment. Basically, they've become, over the years, a complete bomb site, these houses. And it's made living and enjoying the space and the place and enjoying life near on impossible. So in order to sort it out, what they have to do is they have to take all the stuff out of their house, literally everything. They pack it up as if they're moving, furniture and all. And they move it to this giant warehouse where they lay it all out. And it's absolutely staggering when you realise how much stuff you can fit in your house. And then they get to go through it all and they have to get rid of loads of it. And then they put back the things that are really important to them and mean something. and then they can start to live differently. For almost everybody on that programme, the hardest bit and the most difficult bit of the whole process is the willingness to let go of things and to change from what has become a safe, a well-known path for living that meant they have survived over the years, even if they've not thrived. Being willing to let go of a way of doing things, a way of thinking, a way of relating is sometimes difficult, but sometimes it's necessary to really thrive. Sometimes life is a bit like that for us, isn't it? We've got used to certain ways of living, ways of talking to God, ways of opening ourselves up to him or not, ways of thinking about and dealing with our own sin and limitations. And it can be scary to go, maybe I can do it differently. It can be scary to try and bring it to the surface, to allow the truth and the reality to be known, even to ourselves. But it can mean the difference between just surviving and thriving. But it does mean trusting God's love for you. It does mean trusting his patience and kindness towards you. Let me play doctor for a moment. How many of us have said at one point or another, either outwardly or inwardly, I just don't really feel loved? Often in that moment, we're talking about how we feel about others, aren't we? How I don't feel loved by my husband or my friends or my parents, my church family, my small group, my pastor, whoever it is. How many of us have said that? And some of those things are probably true. Those people probably haven't loved you as they could have or how they should have. But I want to say this. If you're feeling that and saying that, often tied in with it, I think, is a lack of knowing and experiencing God's love for you. Because when that feels absent, we often try and replace it with somebody else's love. The main problem, if you like, is actually vertical. We're not rejoicing and experiencing God's love in the way we can. Our relationship with God is the one that often feels dry and joyless and loveless. So we seek in others what only God can give us. If you find yourself saying or thinking, I don't really feel loved, then perhaps it's a moment to reflect on your relationship with God first, and where perhaps you might see just once again that glimpse of his loving patience and kindness to you. That, if you like, is my first hope for the year. That we would know in our heads and our hearts once again God's love for us. And I've intentionally spent the vast bulk of our time this morning on that. Because our love for one another is simply a reflection. So in some ways, our love for one another is limited by our knowledge and our experience of God's love for us. But what about our love for each other? Just a few comments here, really, as we go through the last few little bits of these few verses in 1 Corinthians. If you look through the Bible at lots of the times where God is described as patient and kind and his steadfast love is highlighted, then it's when? It's when his people have turned against him. It's when evil is flourishing. It's when he is being rejected. It's not always and often when he's surrounded by friends, but by enemies. Love is patient and kind in the face of suffering, in the face of rejection, pressure, threats, wickedness. God's love for you began long before you'd even acknowledged him. Listen to Paul in Romans. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. As much as it's a bit trite to say it, we do all have a tendency, don't we, towards loving those who love us. It's easier to love, to be patient, to be kind with those who love us. It's easier when we're on the same page about things, when we feel safe, when we feel accepted. But God's love is different because it comes to us when we still hate him. It's easier to love in the good times. It's easier to love when we don't feel threatened, when we don't feel got at, when we don't feel rejected or sinned against. But if we're to be a reflection of God's love, then we need to be marked by a kind of love that persists in the midst of rejection, in the midst of threat, in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of hatred. God's love continues to be patient, even when that rejection continues, even when his love is not reciprocated. God's love continues to be kind. Here's another quote. Kindness works to appease and extinguish the community fires set by the anger of others, not only by enduring nobly, but also by soothing and comforting. Because of God's love for us, because of the joy, the security that gives us, we can move towards everyone in the church family and beyond with an undeserved, loving patience and kindness, even when it's not acknowledged, even when it's not reciprocated, even when it causes pain and suffering, even when it costs us. I'm not going to go through all the it's not, love is not, love is not, love is not in this passage. But let me read it again, as it were, and make a few brief comments on them. A few brief comments on what Paul says love is not. And notice as we go through it, there is a thread that runs through all of them. And it's that love isn't interested in itself, but love is primarily interested in the good of the other. And ask yourself, what would it mean for our church to be marked by these things this year? Love does not envy or boast. Envy and jealousy kill love because it becomes about me versus you. But love rejoices in the kindness God has given to you, even when I've not experienced that same kindness or blessing. But that's only going to happen if I know God's kindness to me. Love is not arrogant or rude. How much behaviour, to be honest, amongst us, even amongst church ministers, to be honest, is actually attention-seeking, designed to impress others with one's own supposed importance. When that happens, it's arrogance. And rude here is related to behaving dishonestly on a way that brings shame to the church. Neither are loving, of course, because they focus on wanting to make us something or to fulfill our desires at the expense of others. But we're only going to avoid these things if we're willing to trust in God's patience and kindness as we wrestle with them in our hearts. Love doesn't insist on its own way. Don't we want to create a world around us that makes us feel safe and secure, so our priorities take precedence? Well, that's not love. That's not how we've seen God act towards us, who sent his only Son, who gave up the glories of heaven for us, for you. No, love wants to do everything for the good of other people. Love would rather give up its preferences for others. Love is not irritable or resentful. Love isn't easily wound up or angered. Frustration doesn't build quickly. Love also doesn't keep a record of wrongs. That's the idea of resentful. It doesn't say, here we go again. Because that's how God has loved us. As far as the east is from the west. That's how far he's removed our transgressions from us. Love wants justice. That's basically verse 6. It cares for the downtrodden and the weak and the welfare of others, and delights to see God's truth and his ways finding a foothold in people's lives. What would it be like? What would it look like to be a church where the tone was this other-centered love? A love that is patient and kind. A love that is so secure in God that it will continue despite opposition, despite rejection, despite the cost. We can be a church with this kind of love, but only if we know, experience and trust in the very same love that God shows to us each and every day. Love bears and endures all things, the hardest things, the deepest rejections, the most difficult conversations, because it believes all the truths of the gospel and has a sure hope that God's loving kindness will prevail in the end. After the difficulties, the conflicts, the challenges of the last 2 years, as we look ahead to the challenges that lie ahead, I'd love for 2022 to be a year where we pursue a love for one another that reflects God's love for us. And we're going to turn to God now in song, but let me pray as the musicians come up. Oh, Lord and Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are a loving God who is gracious and compassionate. Father, where we have lost sight of your love for us, remind us of it. Father, stir our hearts and our minds. Father, lead us to reflect that very same love with one another over this year ahead. Amen.